a peaceful day. Welcome to our neutrality course on neutrality in the 21st century and why it remains relevant webinar series. And currently, we're on the session 2. We're looking more here in our session about the case of neutrality. So it's now more on the application of the neutrality. How does it look like? How does the states really practice neutrality in a practical sense? And what are the threats of the neutrality? So while we are waiting for all the participants to come in our today's session, let us just take a minute or two. You can just grab your coffee or have a restroom break for the minute, and then we'll start our session for today. And if you haven't been in our first session, we have the recording on the first session that was sent around in your emails. Hopefully you're able to watch it. And if not, we're going to post the link here in our chat box again for you to copy and maybe watch it later on. So you can have a review or have the context on how do we define neutrality. And if you are, of course, interested to learn more about the neutrality, we have the readings per sessions as well. And if you want to have advanced reading or further readings for the sessions and for our upcoming sessions and the previous sessions, you're very welcome to access our reading materials. All right, thank you. I think Emily posted in the chat box. Yeah. And if you have some questions related to the neutrality for our session, last session, and to our session today, you can start making notes. And for the session for today, and if we're not able to answer all the questions, we will just kindly send us an email and definitely we'll go back to you. I think for the last session one, for those who sent their emails, their questions via our email, it's already been answered. And if you miss something, just kindly send us again. And then we will provide those questions to our speakers last week. And then we will get you the responses via email as well. All right. So I think let's begin for our session 2. And before we begin, let's have a short recap on what happened on the session 1. So as you remember, for session 1, we tackled about what is neutrality, the overview of the over the neutrality. So for today recap, I prepared a mini quiz for us. It's only 5 questions, very easy. And I want us to use the chat box. Yes, hopefully I think everyone can type their answers in the chat box, and then I will flash the questions. We will have time limit. At least for some questions, there were 20 seconds and 10 seconds, and you can just type your answer in the chat box. So I want to see if you can all access the chat box. Can you press 1 for our participants? All right, good. 1, 1, 1. All right, so I think our chat box is working. So I think we're ready for the quiz. Let's see. Let me just share my screen. All right. Let me just begin. Let me share my screen. Okay, let's begin our first question of the day. So, for our first question, neutrality is anywhere and everywhere reaction to A, peace, B, conflict. Oops. It's already been 20 seconds already. I hope you're able to type your answer. Okay, 1, conflict. Right, that's right. Ashmita, yes. So just a little bit recap. Last week we talked about the neutrality in a simple definition. As you remember in session 1, when we tackled about that neutrality is anything that's towards reaction towards conflict. So neutrality, that's reaction is primary to conflict, and neutrality is the center of conflict. As you remember in this diagram, the letter A, it towards to the conflict and not to the belligerent parties or the two party. And more often, the neutrality is flexible and open for interpretation. So that's why there's some because it's very open in interpretation, there's sometimes fuzzy or interpret in a very different ways. And neutrality is born, if we still remember, neutrality is born out of the law of the sea during the 12,000 CE. It formalized during the treaties, and it's made by and for by the big states. So it's about how the states will conduct their trade, how the states will conduct economically when there's a war. And if we remember last time, that the neutral parties, in terms of the law of the neutrality, the neutral states are both at peace and equal to both states who are in conflict. So neutrality means the states are neutral to the conflict and not to the conflicting parties, and the neutral actors remains at peace with both actors that are at war with each other and remain in good terms, such as the case of the Switzerland during the World War II, where it still remains that their trading relationship with UK and as the permission with the German. And if you remember, the term neutrality comes from the word neuter, which also means neither. So it friends to all and foe to neither. So in modern times, it means also like, remember, like the Twitter hashtag, um, not, not war. So it means that, I'm sorry, both of the parties are in war, but we're still doing the same. We're still conduct our business with the both parties. Of course, it's not just this is, in this case, is a very nutshell of the neutrality. It has still, there's so much definition and concept that we have to study about the neutrality. So, and just to also remember from our from our last session, that neutrality only exists when the states take position into the conflict. So if you remember this man in the moon who doesn't know about the conflict, it means that they are not neutral because they doesn't know anything about that conflict. So only the states who are takes position in the conflict are the ones, that's when the neutrality applies. All right, that's for the first question. For the second question, it will only be for 10 seconds. So let's practice our typing skills. A true or false question. So true or false, does neutrality means always? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. False. Yes. Oh, I think people are watching last week. Yeah, that's true. As we discussed last time, permanent neutrality does not mean always, but it means lasting. So it means the permanent states, permanent neutrality, it means that the Article 53 in the United Nations conventions, it means that the states who are in permanent neutrality will not engage into, for the right of the collective security, they have the right to defend themselves in the war, but they will not help others to defend them to help others to defend themselves during the war. So for this case, such as the case of Switzerland and Finland that has the stance of the permanent neutrality, which is today we're looking into the case of the Finland as well. So the current neutrality that most of the states are in now is what we call this occasional neutrality. It means that the state's occasional neutrality means that the state chose to be neutral, and we have to bear in mind that there are lots of possible conflicts that could happen. It's not a simple triangle of the conflict, but it looks like this. There are lots of possibilities and conflicts that happen between and among the neutral states. So neutrality does not, what neutrality do is that it prevents the war from further happening. So neutrality per se does not inherit a peaceful duty due to its possible influence or not influence in the war. But what it do is constrict from war from further happening, or to further escalate the war from happening. So for another true or false, okay, another 10 seconds to practice our typing skills. Okay, does the fact of war still creates the fact of neutrality in true or false? Let's just see. Hopefully. True. Yes. I was scared. I thought that the first time that I saw is false, but yeah, that's true. The fact, if you remember last week, this is I think our last slide with Pascal. The fact of war still creates the fact of finality because currently this war still exists and still happening. Even we upload the war during the UN convention, it means that also if we upload the war, it means that we upload neutrality because neutrality only exists when there's a war happening. However, because of the current instance that's happening in the world right now and with the situations that happening, does the neutrality still exist and it's still relevant in our modern times. And it's very and today we're going to see further like how does neutrality applies and what are the threats if you are neutral states with the Finland, Ireland, and Austria. And again, to remind neutrality, what we said last time, it's not it's like the cure for cancer, if we will put it in that a simple analogy. That neutrality, it does not heal all the cancer cells, but what it does, it prevents further the cancer cells to further damage the body. So neutrality cannot eliminate the war from happening. But what can it do? It prevents the war or tame the war from happening or heal the war from happening. So currently, as we see, we are in the multipolar world, which give us more hope to have more neutral states and increase the non-alignment movement, which is, I think, we're further discussed in case of the Finland. And the non-alignment movement, if we recall last week, the non-alignment movement refers, it's a political and a very pragmatic approach to what's happening right now in the multipolar world. The non-alignment movement, it's built for the states not to align with the bigger or the hegemonic states. I think our speakers for today will speak more about the non-alignment movement, especially in the case of Finland. And what does the law of neutrality, okay, for the next question, oh, sorry, I think I read the left. The next question, what does the law of neutrality anchor with? I third here. Is it international humanitarian law, court of justice, customary law, domestic legal systems? Okay, for the what does the law of neutrality anchored with? This is, we say last week that law of neutrality is a customary law. Yes, thank you, Nathan. It's letter C. Yeah. It means that the law of neutrality is based on the customary law. It means that the states agreed upon and it's codified under the Hague Convention. So customary means it's binding to all states. Also, last week we learned that neutrality, it's not the choice of state to be neutral. If the state is not part of the international armed conflict, with define international armed conflict, it's covered by international humanitarian law. It means that when the two parties claim that they're both aggrieved and they both shoot to each other and they both claim that they are aggrieved, and then the international humanitarian law applies. So, and applies as soon as the, yeah. So the law of neutrality regulates the neutral states and conflict parties. It prohibits neutrals to be involved in international armed conflict and to influence the outcome of the conflict. And it protects them from the effects of the conflict. Okay, for the next question. This is the last question. True or false? The neutrals have the freedom to continue peaceful relations in belligerent states. Okay, the answer is true. Yes, thank you, Ashmita. Yeah, as we mentioned before, that the neutrals have the right, the neutrals have the freedom to continue peaceful relations to belligerent states, and the neutral states have obligations and duties. And if you remember, the duty of the neutral states and the duty of impartiality, non-participation, prevention, and duty of internment. And duty of impartiality means they should give the same equal support to both aggressor and victims or both belligerents. And the duty of non-participation is not participating or escalating war from happening. And duty of prevention means should not support in any means or the use of force. And the duty of internment means should allow the belligerents to enter should allow the both belligerents to enter in the territory. So the neutrals have a duty also not to supply weapons in Article 6 and Article 7 in any manner, directly or indirectly, to the belligerent power, including warships, ammunitions, or war material, or any kind, or so whatever. And of course, the law of neutrality has its own shortcomings and challenges, such as the position of power of between the victim states and the aggressive states. But however, the neutrality still remains binding to all the states and prevent war from further happening. And I cannot emphasize that furthermore, as we learned that from the last session. So to further see like how does really neutrality apply in a state level? So for now, we're going to see it like how for this session 2, we're more looking on the case of the global north. And for the next session, we'll have the global south. So for today's session, we'll have the case of Austria, Finland, and Ireland. And for this first case study, we'll look first in the, let me just see my quickly. We'll see first on the case of Finland, to be discussed by the Finnish himself, Dr. Professor Jussi Hanhimäki. He's the professor and chair of the Department of International History and Politics and Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Switzerland. So, Professor Dr. Jussi Hanhimäki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And let me see if I can, what do I do to share my screen? Let's see. Is that now all visible for everybody? So listen, thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's an important topic. Obviously, I'm just the introduction. I am originally from Finland, so I have an obvious bias here, and I'm sure in some ways. And I used to call myself super neutral simply because I carry two passports. One is from Finland, the other one is from Switzerland. So in the European context, you couldn't get much more neutral than that. That's me. Now, what I would though say is that the other thing about this topic and Finland is that, well, two things about Finland that bear mentioning. Number one, it is no longer neutral. But Finland joined NATO last year on the 4th of April of 2023, which was in fact, it was on NATO's 74th anniversary, if I'm correct. Finland became the 31st member state of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which effectively meant that neutrality was finished. The second thing about Finland that many of you probably know or don't, but you should, is that Finland just elected a new president yesterday. And there was an election. It was very close, in which one of the and it sort of is relevant here because the role of the president of Finland is particularly pronounced in foreign and security policy. And so that was the issue. And there were two candidates at the end in the second round who agreed on one thing, that NATO membership was the right thing. So there's a kind of a consensus in Finland about being now the 31st member state of NATO and so forth. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to come back to that perhaps towards the end a little bit, and maybe in the Q&A you can also go back to that, why no longer neutrality. But well, what I'm talking mostly about is the period when Finland was neutral, and that sort of extends from the end of World War II to indeed 2023. With the joining of NATO. So that's the topic. These are the two. So that's hence my subtitle, Cold War Neutral to a NATO member. And it's important to recognize that Finland's neutrality really is different. We have Heinz, who will be talking about Austria afterwards, where there's in fact neutrality is a legally binding thing in the Austrian constitution. There is no such thing. There never was such a thing in the Finnish constitution. So it is very much a sort of decision of policy made by Finnish political leaders in a certain context in the late 1940s that then extends and goes, yes, throughout the Cold War, but even beyond for several decades afterwards. So so my agenda is roughly here. Three key points I wanted to cover. One is the importance of geography in all of this, and I think this is something that you can't escape. Geopolitics may not be fashionable as a subject of academic study, but it's a reality, I think. And in Finnish case, it of course means that Finland is where it is. You can't move Finland away from where it is, and it is located next to Russia, or during the Cold War, of course, next to the Soviet Union. And so the neutrality that emerges in the 1940s and 50s is a byproduct in part of that geographic and geopolitical position. So that's the beginning point. The second point I want to just look at is the sort of overall the 70 plus years of neutrality, which see a lot of continuity, but of course the context of international relations changed. Finnish politics changed, and end of the Cold War is a major point in which questions about neutrality and political orientation of Finland vis-a-vis the rest of the world become important, and it leads initially to membership in the European Union, for example. And so part of the European integration process, and eventually then last year to abandoning neutrality completely. And it's the third point, of course, is that it is a security policy. It is a national security policy that as of February 2022, for most Finns became untenable, unthinkable as a sufficient security policy anymore because of what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. And given the similar geopolitical location of Finland next to Russia as Ukraine, that obviously raised a lot of concerns and shifted debate within Finland very quickly in favor of abandoning neutrality, becoming a NATO member state. So that's what I want to go. So very quickly, the past geography rules. There's another map that goes, actually this is from the 19th century, and just to remind you, if you didn't know, and there's no reason why most of you would know, the Finnish history is defined very much by geography, where Finland is located. It's the phrase between east and west has been sort of characteristic of Finland's position for a very, very long time. For many centuries, Finland was part of the Swedish Empire. It's led to all sorts of ill feelings later on between Finland and Sweden, which are now usually sort of limited to ice hockey games and so forth and what have you. But more seriously, then in 1809, during the Napoleonic Wars, well, Sweden lost a war, and hence Russia took over Finland as part of the the Russian Empire, and Finland stayed in that position until 1917, when the combination of World War I, the Russian Revolution, made independence possible. And Finland on December 6, 1917 declared independence. What you see on the in the map there is Finland as it was back then after 1917. It is not the same Finland as what you will find on the map today, because World War II then changed Finland's borders significantly. So a large chunk in the eastern southeastern part of Finland was lost to the Soviet Union as a consequence of World War II. And so, which obviously then has left certain historical ill feeling, as you can imagine, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the successor state, Russia. So that's the sort of the pre-neutrality Actually, Finland was part of empires, became independent, but was in a somewhat difficult geographic position. It fought World War II on the wrong side, because it's bordering the Soviet Union. So it indeed, for several years, Finland was fighting alongside Nazi Germany. And then eventually negotiated a separate peace agreement with the Soviet Union and got out of the war a year before Germany eventually collapsed. So that allowed Finland to maintain independence, get out of the war a bit earlier than most, and then in terms of Finnish policy, vis-a-vis the rest of the think about what would be the next step post World War II. And so what we get to in a few years after World War II ends is a neutral Finland inside Cold War Europe. That map there shows roughly the two military alliances of the Cold War: NATO, the blue one, of course, and the Warsaw Pact. And then the white bits are the non-aligned or neutral states of Europe in the context of the Cold War. So Finland, Sweden, Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, Yugoslavia, which is part of the non-aligned movement. I think you'll talk more about that at another context. So Finland is part of that particular geopolitical arrangement, but is one of the neutral bits in between East and West. Now, Finnish neutrality, like I said in the beginning, there's no law as such regulating Finnish. It's essentially a policy decision, and it becomes over time to be seen as a successful policy because Finland stays outside of major conflicts throughout the Cold War period and beyond. And so security, in thinking back to World War II and what was before, security seems to be better served through this policy of neutrality. The trouble is the neutrality is not without conditions, but it is the sort of one side of that is a specific agreement negotiated between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1948, in which the Finns basically agree that if another power tries to use Finnish territory to attack the Soviet Union, then Finland will fight against that, will fight on the side of the Soviet Union. And there's an anonymous clause there that also is that even if there's a threat that something like that might come, then that should lead to consultations between the Finnish and the Soviet leaders. So that's a sort of a cloud in terms of many and where the term Finlandization emerges, because it means that Finns are sort of have to play some kind of lip service towards the Soviet Union to make sure that there's no excuse in essence that the Finnish policy would give an excuse for the Soviets to consider them as a threat. And so that leads to certain, there's a big Finnish literature on this, but among other things, sort of criticism of the Soviet Union in neutral Finland, in neutral Cold War Finland, is very, very limited. And there is a kind of a self-censorship that emerges in the Cold War context, and Finlandization is one of the meanings of the term Finlandization. We can come to that term later. It's something that was proposed and later on for Ukraine as a solution for its security. You have to Finlandize Ukraine. Some suggest, but we can come to that. I'm not going to get into that now. Post-Cold War is then, of course, where we are now, and one of the things that happens after the Cold War is, and many of you are, of course, fully aware of this, that NATO, after the initial debates in the early 1990s, NATO not only stays alive as a military alliance, a defensive military alliance, but begins to enlarge gradually. Initially in 1999, to Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, so 3 states that used to be members of the Warsaw Pact. And then 5 years later, the big enlargement, and there's been gradual enlargement continues, even during the Trump presidency. NATO actually gains a new member, despite all the rhetoric that President Trump of the United States says about, you know, NATO being obsolete and useless, and well, never mind what he's just said in the last a day or so ago about NATO and Russia. That's another topic, but NATO is enlarging. However, of course, what doesn't happen in the first 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, none of the neutral countries of Cold War Europe, so Finland, Sweden, Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, none of those countries abandons neutrality in this in the first 3 decades post Cold War decades, despite this clear sentiment of the worst NATO enlargement. And it is only after 24th of February 2022 that you know, when Russia invades Ukraine, that you get to the moment that in countries like Finland and Sweden, suddenly opinion polls about NATO membership, as you can see here in the middle of the screen, in 2017, there's very limited support for abandoning neutrality to joining NATO. For example, in Finland, only 19% of those polled in 2017 were in favor of Finland joining a military alliance. After February 24th, 2022, that support dramatically quadruples, goes almost to 70%. And that is a clear reaction to the, so it seems to me, to the sense of insecurity that emerges from Russia's military invasion of Ukraine. No matter what the reasons for that, from Finnish perspective, neutrality doesn't seem to any longer guarantee security in a way that it had for the past 7 decades prior to that moment. And so you have a very rapid movement. Finland and Sweden as well approach NATO, they apply for membership, and Finland, within just over a year, then joins NATO as the 31st member state. We see in the picture there in the middle is actually one of the 2 candidates for presidency, Pekka Haavisto, there in the picture on the right, who was foreign minister at the time, and well, he lost the election yesterday. Another former foreign minister became president instead. So we have that, and that, you know, in essence, of course, what it means is the end of neutrality in Northern Europe, because Sweden also has applied for membership. Its membership is very, very likely, because there were some hiccups with 2 member states, Turkey and Hungary, opposing this. They both now, Turkey clearly has dropped its objections to Sweden joining, and even the case of Hungary, that is on the process. So what has happened, in other words, is that with the abandonment of neutrality, the whole European security architecture, in essence, has been quite dramatically transformed. Finland, there's now a new border, much longer border between NATO and Russia. That is in the middle in the middle map there, where you see the red part is something that has been added just a year ago as a new border, which of course then means potential tension and potential spark of hostilities between Russia and NATO going forward. The cartoon there, of course, is making summing up the situation. Putin sent us with Finland and Sweden running into NATO's headquarters in Brussels. So that's where we are. I'm going to close with, I'm told I had like 20 minutes max. I'm sure I've already exceeded it, but I'll try to sum up with a couple of points. Pictures there show what is happening on the has been happening on the Finno-Russian border, also the new NATO-Russia border last year, which is that the above picture shows the new fence, which is sort of like the border fence in between Mexico and the United States, perhaps, and the old one, which was really very sort of haphazard, a little bit of barbed wire here and there, and nobody get it. But so it shows that the sort of new division line between east and west, if you will, in Northern Europe has clearly emerged after 2022 as a consequence of Finland abandoning neutrality, perhaps for good reasons, but still that is the reality. I should say that in terms of that, though, that it's not, while the dramatic thing happened last year, the formal thing happened, Finland had gradually moved closer to NATO over several decades in terms of its military purchases from the United States and so forth, in terms of some military exercises jointly with NATO countries and so forth. Finland's always been close to countries like Norway, which is also of course, shares a small border with Russia way up in the north. So yes, it was clearly Ukraine was a trigger, but it's something that sort of made that continuous evolution that sort of pushed it forward very, very rapidly. So that's one point thing, and it's a security policy. I think that is the only argument there is that was made, that insecurity was enhanced on February 24th, 2022 for most Finns, and that the price was the abandonment of neutrality. The thing about neutrality is that there was no legal treaty, no constitutional amendment necessary to abandon this. It was essentially, it's a political decision. It's a question of security policy to Parliament. It's another treaty to be signed and adopted by the Finnish Parliament, which happened very, very quickly. The consequence is doubling of NATO's border with Russia as a consequence, and of course the likelihood that the direct Russia-NATO conflict or war might be triggered in the Nordic Baltic area. It's probably limited in the immediate future, simply because of, in fact, the conflict in Ukraine sort of sucks up the resources of Russia at the moment. But of course, the likelihood that now there is a new sort of demarcation line. So to simply say, maybe as a concluding statement, what it basically means that whatever the reasons, the reality is that as a consequence of Finland abandoning neutrality, the potential for conflict in Northern Europe is higher now, ultimately, than it has been probably over the last many decades, perhaps since the end of World War II. So that is where I'm going to stop mine, and I look forward to the discussions that we'll have a bit later on.
Thank you, Professor Jussi. I feel like thank you for giving us brief overview about the case of Finland. It has so much information in 20 minutes. And yeah, Professor Jussi also has some readings about the case of Finland. If you want to read it, it's accessible in our reading materials. And for all the questions, we will do it later during our Q&A. But for now, we will have first our second speaker. We'll have the case of Austria. So he's also Austrian by himself. And let me just introduce you. Our second speaker, he's a professor and academic director of Austrian Institute for International Affairs in Austria, and quite an expert of the topic of the neutrality as well, Professor Dr. Heinz Gärtner. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for the invitation and your introduction. I will talk about Austria, but I will also talk a little bit about concepts of neutrality. I do not want to repeat what you said, but I want to put Austria in the context of neutrality concepts as well. A little bit of history, a little bit of law, and also a little bit of political decisions. So I will share my screen. So here we have it. Okay. So I guess, and I do this every way, enlarge it. Can I? Okay. Now we have it. I guess you can see it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So as I said, a little bit of concepts, Michelle, just correct if you think you have a different interpretation, but listening to you, I think we are pretty congruent in what how we identify or define neutrality. And as Jussi already pointed out, that we have this neutrality in a political and historical tradition, not based on international law. And here, in contrast, I do have these examples which are based on international law. That's Austria and the Swiss example. I guess the Austrian neutrality is even a little bit stronger because it's based on constitutional law and on international law. And there's some confusion about this expression permanent neutrality, and Michelle touched upon this a little bit. And in Austria, there's a debate which suggests that permanent means eternal. There is no eternity here in this permanent neutrality. Not permanent means which is important. I come back to it a little bit later. Permanent means in war and in peace times. So continuous, and Michelle, you called it always. You can call it always as well, but it's continuous neutrality, not only in times of war, as occasional neutrality would suggest, and especially occasional neutrality was dominant in the 19th century and after the Second World War. Permanent neutrality becomes more and more an important concept, even so not necessarily the dominant concept, because we do have a lot of other types of neutrality, the self-declared neutrality, which are pretty weak. And to some extent, Sweden and Finland had a self-declared neutrality as well. But we have other examples like Moldova. We have it in Serbia, but also we had it in certain periods in Ukraine. Ukraine never was based on Ukraine declarations of neutrality was not based on anything, and that why they could abandon it and put NATO membership in the constitution in 2014. Very important is and historically important is the distinction between integral and positive. No, sorry. Integral and differential neutrality. So the positive neutrality is something else, but the integral and the differential neutrality. So integral neutrality is an old Swiss concept and basically means a comprehensive neutrality in all dimensions, not only military, but also political and economic, and also in terms of value, a sort of isolationism. And then also we had a debate, especially in Switzerland after the First World War, when there was the League of Nations, and the debate whether Switzerland should participate in sanctions. They somehow changed the policy and said, okay, differential neutrality more or less means selective neutrality. So militarily, yes, but not necessarily economic neutrality. I mention this here non-aligned movement because the non-aligned movement has something very important with neutrality. That means not participating in military alliances. That's the reddest of the red lines for neutral states not joining a military alliance. And that's Of course, there are different, as we have seen also in history, the historically non-aligned movement, there are differences. And non-aligned state would have allowed great powers also deploy weapons and bases on their territory. A neutral state would not be allowed to do that. But now the non-aligned movement is getting steam again, getting much more important. Finland, Sweden gave up neutrality, but new types of neutrality are emerging, and I would say non-alignment is one of this. In Austria, in the 70s, the Austrian Chancellor Kreisky coined the term active neutrality, and active neutrality also means not being passive, as the term suggests. Active neutrality means also that neutral states have an active foreign policy, being host of summit meetings, host of international organizations, but also engaged in the Middle East, for example, or suggestions for a Marshall Plan in the Third World. So an active international policy, and it was also the time on the height of the Social Democratic International, and that's more or less was this a social democratic idea as well. So, and I now use the term engaged neutrality. I come back to this a little bit later, because we're not in the 70s anymore, and Austria, for example, is part of the European Union and also part of the European foreign security defense policy, participates in the Partnership for Peace of NATO, also increased, to my mind, not enough, international missions, participating in peacekeeping operations. So engaged neutrality, to some extent, is a little bit a normative term, because the Austrian neutrality policy is not really following engaged neutrality. But that's what I'm arguing now. Engaged neutrality is basically the necessary term in order to move beyond integral neutrality or isolationist neutrality. So far to the concepts. So here we do have this Austrian international, the Austrian neutrality law. I think this is, in a nutshell, the best interpretation of neutrality law we can find. Very succinct, very short, and it covers basically all what is important. Here we have again permanent neutrality, which is kind of a smart formulation. Permanent neutrality means both, as I said, in war and in peace times, but it also means not participating in foreign wars, based on the interpretation of the Hague Convention of 1907. So that means permanent neutrality, not just stepping out and participate in some foreign wars with troops or whatever. So that is the first feature, non-participating in foreign wars. And then in the second paragraph, we have the other two important features. The most important, what I think, is not joining a military alliance, because as a neutral state, you cannot promise other states to come to their aid in times of war or in times if they're attacked. That would just abandon the idea of neutrality. If you promise somebody you in future you might go to war, so that would it's just not that's not compatible with neutrality. And the second feature in the second paragraph is that Austria was not allowed to deploy foreign troops on its soil, also permanently. Of course, there can be military attaches, and so that's three points: not participating in foreign wars, not participating in military alliance, and not allowing foreign troops to be based on Austrian soil. Very, very simple, but very comprehensive. Then I mentioned this because it's under-researched. When Austria became neutral in 1955, that was the neutrality law. When the neutrality law has been adopted by the parliament, it's important to say that the parliament adopted the law by itself because that was especially an American request. Because then there was the idea that the Soviet Union could not come in and interpret the Austrian neutrality law in their way. So Austria adopted it by itself, but it became a constitutional law. In contrast to many other historical interpretations, the Americans supported Austrian's neutrality. President Eisenhower supported Austrian neutrality as long it was an armed neutrality. So Eisenhower did not really want that there would be a vacuum. And I have to mention also the Soviet Union in the Communist Party. There was a division. So some supported, or let's say some were open for neutrality, like Khrushchev and Karaganov, but others, the Foreign Minister Molotov and Suslov and Kaganovich, they opposed neutrality and for a while. And only when there was this argument, as long as a German militarism, there's no place for Austrian neutrality. So that was around 1954 when the Soviet Union took a harsher stance against neutrality. But when it became clear that Germany was joining the NATO military alliance and Austria would not be with Germany, the Khrushchev factions dominated and would say, okay, we accept Austrian neutrality. So a little bit complicated history. But then Austria became a model for Central Europe, because there was the idea Germany for 10 years was divided and Austria was united. So there must be something for Austria, because Austria was occupied by four powers, as Germany was, from 1945 to 1955. Neutrality, there was neutrality, and the foreign troops would leave Austria, right? And now Austria was united, neutral Germany was divided. So let's look at that Austrian example. So some would say that it was, of course, a prominent George Kennan, who was the former US ambassador to Moscow, and he suggested, okay, let's have a neutral Central Europe, like the model of Austria, including Germany, of course, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland. So these states had to leave the Warsaw Pact, of course, but on the other hand, Germany would be neutral as well. Similar initiatives came from a US bipartisan initiative, Humphrey Noland, the British Labour Party, all the same ideas. And then we had the Rapatsky plan, who also looked at the Austrian model. He looked a little bit at the Finnish model as well. But Austria, parallel to the neutrality law, a state treaty was adopted, which has been signed by the victory powers. So legally, these are two different laws: neutrality law and state treaty. And the state treaty gives Austria some obligations, how to behave and how to fill in basically neutrality. And one was that Austria should not become, was prohibited to get nuclear weapons. So Austria from 55 on was by law a nuclear weapon-free state. Different to Sweden, different to Switzerland. They all experimented with nuclear weapons. Austria was prohibited. And that's why Rapatsky looked at Austria and said, okay, fine, we have a neutral, non-nuclear weapon state. Let's apply it to Central Europe. So he suggested and disengaged Central Europe as a nuclear weapon-free zone, right? And this was basically the idea that Austria was very active, and the initiator of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is in force right now, and no other states could have done it. A neutral, non-nuclear weapon state could have initiated this treaty, and because no nuclear weapon states joined, no state which is allied with a nuclear weapon states like NATO state, they didn't join the PAN treaty. Nevertheless, since 2021, it is in force. That was one asset, that's an example of engaged neutrality, for example. That is, of course, there would have been a possibility that Ukraine would adopt a similar neutrality model as Austria. I would say, but we can discuss this later, I would say it would have prevented the war. And in March 3, I also wrote an article, or Ukraine should look at the Austrian model in order to prevent a war. Either Ukraine will be permanent neutral, or it will permanent divided like Germany. That was my suggestion at that time. Of course, nobody listened. And one thing I want to mention, because Jussi talked about it before, Finland did not use the term neutrality before Austria became neutral. So Finland, after the Friendship Treaty in 1949, the Finland always argued, we want to stay out of big power competition, which basically is some sort of neutrality. But neutrality was something suspicious a little bit. And after 1955, Finland used the term neutrality. And the Soviet Union would always say Friendship Treaty, and the Finns would always say neutrality. So the neutrality was some sort to get some instrument to get some room of maneuver towards the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet invasion in 1968, the Soviet Union get upset and deleted all the term neutrality out of all bilateral agreements between Finland and the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev changed it then. So we have now different phases of neutrality. We have the neutrality, of course, during the East-West conflict and the Cold War. Some argued now, after the end of the Cold War, that would say, why would they want to stay neutral? Because it's all a thing of the Cold War. And so I have to say, neutrality during the Cold War was the exemption of the Cold War, because the Cold War was about blocks, NATO, Warsaw Pact, and the neutral states managed to stay out of this block confrontation. So it was an exception of the block confrontation. That's what neutral states tried to do. They were very constructive already as some sort of active neutrality, because they engaged in this CSE process, the Conference on Security and Cooperation, which was pretty much successful, leading to the Helsinki Summit of 1975, or let's put it starting with the Helsinki Summit in 1975. After the end of the Cold War, we had this unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer coined the term, which was a difficult time for neutral states, because if you have a hegemon here, a hegemon does not really accept neutral spaces. So we have a hegemonic power and unipolarity. And there was this example when of course, then there was we had several, many, actually the unipolarity, some political scientists in the USA speak of a hegemonic peace. There was no hegemonic peace. The idea is you have a hegemon and no challenger, and there will be peace. There was no peace. There was no peace because there were many wars, and American studies suggest that after 1776, the unipolar period after 1991 faced most of the US military interventions in history. That's 25%. And one of them, of course, as we know, was Balkan, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. One was Afghanistan. It was that the American ambassador, officials, and went to the Austrian defense ministry and the Austrian foreign minister saying, why don't you send more troops to Afghanistan? Austria was very hesitant and would send some TSO officers, less than 20. And the Austrians say, why does it lead to? That's the war doesn't really have a positive, also international forces cannot bring a positive end to it. And Austria was engaged in the Balkan as peacekeepers anyway. But after 20 years of war, we see now that neutral Austria had the correct analysis and probably the better intelligence that NATO states had. They were very much involved and called it nation building, whatever. And Austria tried to stay out of because of its neutral status. Now, of course, some say we're in a period of multipolarity. I think it's more a euphemism. And multipolarity is some sort of polarization, which is dangerous because we don't have really, we lost a lot of, since the Trump times, we lost a lot of multilateralism, and multipolarity without multilateralism is pretty dangerous, as you have seen before World War I and before World War II. And nevertheless, what we are seeing now is not so much multipolarity, more a great power competition, as American security documents would call it. And also a new bipolarity is emerging between US and China globally, and between Western Europe and Russia in Europe. So here I want just to mention one important thing, that neutrality in the heads of the European citizen is very important. The European Council on Foreign Relations every 2 years has a survey, and they ask the European Union citizens, where would you stand if there is a war between, if there is a conflict between US and China. They didn't even say war, and they didn't even say military conflict. And so they asked the European citizens what to do if you have a conflict between US and China. Not so much would join China, so that would be less than 10%, but not so much with the US either. It's about less than 30%. 60 to 65% of the European citizens would say they rather would stay neutral. So that means that's a very rational thinking, that why should Europeans get entangled in a foreign war, in a foreign conflict. I skip this one. If you have this polarization, then smaller states have two choices. Polarization, as I talked about now, we have great power competition and new popularity. Smaller states have two choices. Either they can bandwagon, so they join an alliance to get protection promises, like from NATO with Article 5. So now Ukraine is going this way, but Finland and Sweden decided as well, we are bandwagoning with NATO, rather stay independent. And of course, you have, if you are not only protected if you join, you are also entrapped. As I said before, if it comes to a big power war between China and, for example, and the US. And I have to say, the new NATO documents already refer to China as an Article 5 case as well when it comes to cyber hybrid warfare. So it can trigger that Article 5 as well. So you might be entrapped as well in a big power conflict. But some would argue, like the Swedes and the Finns have done, we don't want to be abandoned in the case of war. That's why we see this fence, what Jussi pointed would put up in the screen as well. So so I don't go too much in this detail. So the second choice smaller states have, in order to avoid entanglement, they can stay neutral. Two choices, bandwagoning or neutrality, in order to avoid to be entrapped or entangled in a big power war. So, but neutrality has to have two features. It has to be credible and it has to be useful. So credible means, as I said in the beginning, what is permanent neutrality about? Credible means you have to always to be visible. Also in peace times, you always have to show, I'm not going to join a military alliance. I'm not participating in foreign wars. I'm not going to deploy foreign troops. That was a mistake of Ukraine. Ukraine said, we are not, we are non-aligned, but probably we will join NATO. That's not credible. That's not credible. But to some extent, armed neutrality is also a feature, a basis for credibility. You show that you should defend yourself in the case of an attack. That what Eisenhower in 1955 requested from Austria. You have to be credible, but you have also to offer something. You have to offer something because big powers, the international community might want to need you. So in terms of realists, for the realist school, they would say, okay, you're useful as a buffer state. And I guess Finland and Sweden were very good buffer states, and the Soviet Union and Russia felt very comfortable with Finland and Sweden as buffer states. Now they gave up the status, and Finland is now becoming a front state instead of a buffer state. But also you can offer peacekeeping troops, host meetings, and being engaged neutrality, which I explained already a little bit also with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and also hosted the negotiations of the Iran nuclear deal, which is dying right now, unfortunately. And also another possibility for engaged neutrality is, and I would say Austrian neutrality is not really accepting or seizing this opportunity. After Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, Austria as the biggest state, but also of course Ireland and Malta, but they are the only ones who are the bridge to the global south because they have the same status as the states in the global south, being non-aligned and being nuclear weapon-free states. So these are in the European Union. So the only states in the European Union which have this status, which is a huge opportunity, which is not seized by Austria, at least. And of course, as I said, engaged neutrality is the opposite of isolationism. And I have to say, we have right-wing parties also in Austria, which also support neutrality, but they support this integral isolation neutrality. Engaged neutrality is the opposite concept to isolationism or integral neutrality. So there are some assets of neutral states. I just mentioned them here. They show that they don't have geopolitical interests of like global powers. They are not aligned with big powers. They don't really represent the interests of big powers. They have more room of maneuver for negotiating, mediating. In many ways, they are more credible for NGOs when it comes to humanitarian missions. and they are not joining military alliances with nuclear weapons. So just to give you an idea that what neutrality also can offer. So now one important point, Michelle, if you allow me to do this, and one important point, because we have this argument now, and we had this in Finland and Sweden and Austria. Nobody is going to protect you. Neutrality, you just abandoned just by yourself. So who is going to protect you? And I did a study with my students as well and looked at cases of neutrality. And we did not really find a case where neutrality was not respected by great powers. So neutrality as such is a good security guarantee, except there is a great power war. If you have a great power war, of course, great powers do not really, in all cases, respect neutrality. In many ways, they don't do it. But neutral states are not the target. The targets are the hostile and great powers, the hostile alliances. That's why we have Belgium, for example. Belgium with a very successful neutrality for 70 years, enshrined in the Vienna Congress, and the Concert of Vienna, of course, has been abandoned or has been attacked by Germany. But this, of course, was the reason why Great Britain entered the war, because Belgian neutrality was violated. That's, you cannot really blame neutral states that they do not prevent a world war or a global war. We have similar cases in the Vietnam War. Laos and Cambodia have been neutral, but in the case of Vietnam War, neither the Viet Cong nor the US respected the neutrality. So neutrality is a pretty good security guarantee. It has been violated in two cases, which we found out: Hawaii, 1895, and Mexico, which had a neutral policy in 1847. So you need not be a member of an alliance in order to protect it. That would be the European Union. Michelle, I don't have the time anymore, right?
Yeah. Just
so
to wrap up,
maybe I will, if somebody asks whether neutrality is compatible with membership in the European Union, I could go back to this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the time being.
Thank you, Professor Heinz, for giving us the case of Austria about being engaged neutrality. I might say, as we presented today, and if you have questions about it, just similar in our chat box, just kindly write it in our chat box, and we'll return it to it later on. But for now, we'll have our last speaker for another 20 minutes. He's the executive director. Live from Ireland. He is part of the he is the Executive Director of Peace and Neutrality Alliance, PANA. And to give us the case of the neutrality in Ireland, Sir Roger, are you?
Ireland was unusual for Europe in that it was a colony of a single state since 1169, which is a long time ago. England essentially conquered us and then had to conquer us again and again and again, because there were a successive number of uprising against the actual occupation of our country by England. Finally, we got rid of England in the 26 counties. This is the current Republic of Ireland, at least, while the northern part of it stayed part of Britain. And obviously that was part and parcel of the long war that happened when the IRA were trying to do it, getting rid of English control of any part of Ireland. But one of the consequences of that was if you like, the foundation hero of the struggle for Irish independence was Wolfe Tone, and he was a great advocate and supporter of Irish neutrality. And then in the 1916 Rising, all the leaders of the 1916 Rising, which essentially led the foundation of the state, were all also members of the Irish Neutrality League. when the then Irish government was negotiating with the British Empire, they sought that Ireland would be recognised as a neutral state. So it's quite deeply rooted. Now, since we joined the European Union, that policy has started to alter, if you like, even initially with the entry into the European Union. But public opinion poll after public opinion poll showed that 66% of Irish people, or thereabouts, somewhere 60, sometimes 70, Irish people supported Irish neutrality. But that hasn't stopped the ruling elite, people who get elected to the parliament, or they lose touch with the values of the people who elect them. And also the reality is that people have other and more immediate issues in Ireland, like housing, the health system and stuff like that. So even though in Ireland, 66% of Irish people support Irish neutrality, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an issue that has a lot of people awake at night. You know what I mean? Essentially, most people believe that England will not reinvade Ireland, and I think that's not an unreasonable position. So the pressure now on people who want to destroy Irish neutrality is to see the European Union as a new imperial state with its own separate army. But again, they're having great difficulty in going that direction, even within the rest of Europe. So what the government is currently doing is trying to increase the size of the army. And you must remember the army was down to about, well, not, you don't know, obviously, was down to about 7,000 to 7,500 people in the entire army and navy and air force system. So there's very, very small military commitment to defending Ireland. And that's because nobody believes England will invade Ireland again, and that it's unlikely that because of where we are, we're peripheral, a country would have to get through a lot of other countries. Just say, for example, Russia. I mean, Russia would have to invade its way right through all of Europe before they got to Ireland. And I don't actually think there's any real evidence that Russia has any such desire to go past the Ukraine. And I'd like to be, if that's not believed, I'd like to see proper evidence to show that that's that they want to take over all of Europe, and I don't think there's any evidence for that. So I don't think there's a current situation or a regard for a war, but we have very little control over what I would call the corporate media to get our message across. They don't give us coverage, and even when we send out a press statement, we get rejected. So nevertheless, where we are is that we are still formally neutral. The opposition in the Irish Parliament is strongly in favour of Irish neutrality, as are a lot of the smaller parties. So there is a possibility that come the next election, that force, which is primarily Sinn Féin, will institutionalise Irish neutrality into the constitution, which is PANA's main objective. Is that all right? Finished.
Thank you, Roger, for sharing us the case of Ireland. I know there is so much to share about it, but thank you for giving us the overview of it at the moment. And we received, with our last 40 minutes of our time, we received many questions in the chat box at the moment, and some of it are already answered. So for now, I'm going to read those who not yet answered to the chat box, and later on we can elaborate more for those who want to ask follow-up questions for those who are already being answered. So since we also have a limited time with Professor with Professor Jussi, so I think Professor Jussi, I'll give you the floor first. There are some questions here for the Q&A. I think that we leave for this discussion first is from Sandra. Could you elaborate more about the Finlandization term, and how do you see the Finnish people, Russian people relationships today, and what could we learn from the Finland case in terms of the importance, applicability, sustainability of neutrality today. And if you want to add more comments on the other questions that being said already. Yes. Professor Jussi? You're muted.
Sorry, can you? I apologize. Can you just quickly repeat? Is it one of the questions?
Yeah, this is one of the questions that we left for the live discussions that we have. Could you elaborate more on the Finlandization term?
Right.
How do you see the Finnish people, Russian people relationships today, and what could we learn from the Finland case in terms of the importance, applicability, sustainability of neutrality today?
Okay, so on the Finlandization term, it's one thing about Finnish neutrality is that historically what we have to, it's important to remember. I mentioned the treaty in 1948 between Finland and the Soviet Union. It's a treaty had a nice name: friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance. From the Finnish perspective, it meant that if the Soviets say something, we have to respond. And there's no choice, because we cannot rely upon external assistance from anywhere. So I think one part of the Finnish neutrality debate is that neutrality is not, it's considered a policy that's it's the least bad option in many ways for many Finns, and when adopted in the context of the Cold War. Because it does mean to many Finns a certain loss of sovereignty. That even discussing possible NATO membership in the 1940s and 50s would most likely lead to some kind of a very aggressive Soviet response, and that was problematic and so forth. So what it means is that the Finnish political rhetoric and so forth is always very reluctant in the Cold War context to make any critical comment about the Soviet Union or Soviet policy. So the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, the Finland is quiet. United States sends troops to Vietnam, Finland is not quiet. But when the Soviet Union does certain things, then Finns tend to be rather quiet. And that's sort of a problem. For many Finns, this is a problem. It means that you're sort of adopting a certain self-censorship, a non-critical attitude towards the Soviet Union, which at the same time, however, is considered the sort of hereditary enemy of Finland. It's the empire of Finland was part of for a long time. It's the empire. It's the Soviet Union, is a country that Finns fought several wars against in the first few decades of their independence. So there's no love lost between these two countries. And I think to adopt the sort of cannot be critical attitude towards in that context, very difficult to it's a hard pill to swallow for many Finns. And that's where the idea of Finlandization comes from, that when external observers look at it, they see it as Finland being less sovereign than a normal country would be. And they see this as problematic, that there's a lack of independence in a sense, that democracy is not quite what democracy should be. If you can't criticize at will, Stalin's purges or something like that, then it becomes a problem. And so that's where the idea comes, and Finlandization becomes sort of a metaphor then in international relations discourse in the 70s and 80s for countries, particularly in Europe, that are calling for some kind of a cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union. So Western countries like that, and there are concerns, for example, about the Finlandization of West Germany, when you have the Social Democrats in power with Willy Brandt and the so-called Ostpolitik, which opens new relations between East and West in the context of Germany. So will this lead to Finlandization, which would eventually lead to Germany's neutralization and exit from NATO and you know, those kinds of scenarios. So it becomes part of that kind of debates and Cold War discourse that remains. Now, in the longer term, what it means is that when the Cold War ends within Finland, there is a kind of a period in which anybody who was less than honest about their feelings about the Soviet Union suddenly is considered a coward, a somehow morally suspect, and politically, you know, there's a kind of a moment in which there's a lot of dirty laundry is being washed within Finnish politics in the 1990s. And the idea of not being critical of other countries is really being questioned in a serious way, and so that's where I think it affects then the post-Cold War relationship between Finland and Russia significantly. And something, there's another question they're asking about what's the impact of Putin in all of this. Well, Putin becomes in Finnish discourse, I mean, he is not quite the Hitler, but he's certainly the new Stalin in the modern version of a Stalin in the Finnish popular discourse these days. And that's the sort of reaction to this in some kind of the historical legacy of being having this self-censorship first imposed and then lifted. Means that Finns are perhaps even more critical of Russia than most others might be, and in the 21st century. In terms of the Finnish case and the importance, applicability, or sustainability of neutrality today, I think it's neutrality is never permanent. I think that was one of the things that you showed in the early part of the Michelle in your slides. There's no permanence in any of this, and it depends a lot on the context and the contingencies that you find yourself in. So Austria, which Heinz was talking about, becomes neutral in 1955 in a very specific kind of context of that moment. So Austrian state treaty, independence, etc. In the Finnish case, it's neutrality is something that emerges as the least worst option in some ways in the 40s and the 50s, but then becomes a sort of comfortable policy that many can accept, because it seems that it provides a secure environment for Finland and in a certain geopolitical context. But when that context changes, and it really starts to change with the Russian takeover of Crimea in 2014, then when that whole thing changes, then the questions about neutrality are also whether it's still sustainable in a different kind of context. I mean, those are the type of questions that will be asked. We can think about, if I may just take one more minute, think about another example, the United States. Now, in principle, the United States is a neutral country for most of its history, effectively until 1941, when Japan invades Pearl Harbor and so forth, and from which emerges the Grand Alliance, and from which then emerges NATO and all the other military alliance and treaties that the United States has. And that kind of isolationist neutrality that the United States practiced very long was no longer sustainable, applicable. It was no longer in a sense in America's national security interest after 1941. So the United States is no longer neutral. In fact, and just last, Eisenhower, who was mentioned, who Heinz mentioned in his speech, gave this speech in which he refers exactly to this point. The United States, for most of its history, was a neutral country. And however, things have changed, and there were other issues now in the 1950s that meant that neutrality was no longer an option for the United States. And so, things change, as they say in simple terms. And when things change, when contingencies change, whether it's a threat from abroad, whether it's political transformations within or without, then neutrality also can become a policy of the past. So, you know, if Finland is moved to the Atlantic next to Ireland, I'm sure it'll be neutral again. However, that's kind of unlikely at the moment.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Jussi. And because Professor Jussi has to leave early today, we'll just entertain one more question who doesn't type their question in the chat box, to which is addressed for that will address specifically for Professor Jussi's presentation about the case of Finland. So will there be any one question on the floor right now directly to Professor Jussi? You can raise your hands so we can acknowledge you. And also from our speakers. And all right. Seeing none, then we'll proceed to other questions that we have on the floor. And currently, if you don't answer your questions during this live session, we apologize in advance, but kindly send us an email of your question and we will send that to our speakers. We'll send in the chat box again our email address where you can send the questions, and then we'll forward it, and then we'll get the response and send it to you later on. But for now, we'll first address some questions related to Austria. We received several questions, and let me read all throughout that for you, Professor Heinz. And some of the questions about it is that, first, thank you for the presentation. It's a comment. It's very interesting insights about the international relations theory. When you mentioned two strategies for weaker states, bandwagoning and neutrality, what are your thoughts on the emerging scholarship on alternative strategies like hedging? How similar, dissimilar is hedging to neutrality? The second question, could you please elaborate more on how Austria is bridging global south neutral states? Another question, now it's more specific for Cambodia. Although Cambodia was trying to be neutral, but at the end, Cambodia still was pushed by Vietnam and US. So I think those are the direct questions for you, Professor Heinz. Any remarks about that?
Yeah, thank you. There's one more that will elaborate a little bit on this, whether neutrality and the European Union is compatible. There's one more in the chat as well. Hedging and neutrality. Actually, I worked with my students, and we elaborated 21 types of neutrality. So neutrality is a very flexible, as Michelle pointed out in her introduction already, very flexible instrument. So it survived because it's adapted to different situations and developed different concepts. So I mentioned, and Michelle did as well, several types of neutrality, but we found 21 types, and one of those is hedging. But hedging is a very general term. Also, big powers can hedge against other threats and in the environment. So neutrality is much more specific and concrete than hedging. But neutral states do hedging as well. So there's no contradiction. That's why we included hedging in one type of neutrality. But it's not very much defined what hedging is. Neutrality is much more clear. So the other now, what I also mentioned here in a response to Jussi as well, and that debate what we have here in Austria, and the historical context that Austria and Finland are different historical context. So in Austria now, there seems that there are some crypto-Atlanticists who use the example of Finland and Sweden, why Austria didn't follow it. And one argument, of course, is, okay, Finland has a very long border with Russia, so there is no Finland has a good reason to join NATO. So I have to mention Austria had a very long border with the Warsaw Pact countries as well. So during the Cold War, Hungary and Czechoslovakia was along, and neutrality served very well. So Austria was some sort of buffer state, but was Finland as well. So the long border is not an excuse for giving up neutrality. That's what I wanted to say here. And so the other questions, the other set of questions is about neutral states. Can there stay neutral in times of war? There have been several examples in the chat here. One is Norway, one is Cambodia. They all fall in the case of big wars. So Norway was, of course, attacked during the First and the Second World War when it tried to stay neutral, like Denmark and Belgium and Netherlands. And so, of course, neutrality is not a guarantee if we have a big war. And Cambodia, the same as I mentioned with the Vietnam War. Cambodia also made a mistake that they did not prevent the Viet Cong to use its territory for delivery of weapons. So it was not really this armed neutrality, which is included in my definition of credible neutrality. Then there is this question, the Global South. Yes, there are many opportunities what Austria could do. There's one good example. The example is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So most of the states who joined this treaty come from the Global South, not from the European Union, because NATO states did not join. But that was already using this status of non-aligned, neutral, and non-nuclear weapon states. We have it in history. Yugoslavia in the 80s was a leading non-aligned state in the non-aligned movement, and at the same time, it was very active in the CSE process, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So multilateralism here and there. And one example for the future, at the end, somehow at the end after the end of the Ukraine war, there has to be at some point some sort of CSE, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. That was this Helsinki summit, and the N&A states, the non-aligned and neutral states, were very active to setting up this process. So I would argue without the neutral and non-aligned states, the CSE would not have happened. And we had this Helsinki summit. And after the war in Ukraine, we will have something similar. We have to have, I would say, similar to the Helsinki summit with some sort of cooperative security, indivisibility of security, and non-violation of sovereignty of states. It will not be Helsinki anymore, because Helsinki now is NATO. It will be another neutral states. Usually I argue Vienna, but it should be or could be some states of the Global South now. The Global South now has to be included in a future European security process, as we had it already, as I mentioned, to some extent in the 80s. So the Global South, and we also can think of a new Vienna Congress of 1815, which gave Belgium and Switzerland birth of neutrality. So, and in my most optimistic vision, that the new Vienna Congress, after the end of the couple of years after the end of the Ukraine war, could give Ukraine again some status of neutrality. But that's okay. That's time of the future speculation. Final point on European Union and neutrality. Of course, there is this argument that neutrality is not compatible with the European Union. Of course, Finland, Sweden, Austria, Ireland, Malta, they're all members of the European Union. They were fine in the European Union. There was no contradiction there. There is an Article 5 in the Lisbon Treaty, the Article 42.7, which is some sort of Article 5 alliance. But all the neutral states negotiated the exemption of this article because the Lisbon Treaty would say the states could decide according to their constitutional requirements whether they want to observe this article or not. So it's a so-called Irish clause. And I have to say all NATO states have the exemption as well, because the treaty says, okay, the NATO states can decide whether they want to observe this article or whether they want rather to first look at the Article 5 of NATO, whether this is more appropriate, the collective defense of NATO. There was this case in 2015 when French President Hollande called upon this 42.7 article security commitments. So all states should come to the aid of one state if the state is attacked. It was a terrorist attack in France. In that case, Austria decided, okay, we participate, but we do it in the way that we send more troops to the peace operations in Mali in order to free off French troops, which was a kind of not really reasonable explanation. So it's a can article, but not a must article. So the European Union and neutral states are pretty compatible. And also the European Union uses neutral states because they are an asset. For example, in peace missions, for example, in Chad, the European Union would say, now it's ended, of course, the mission, but they would say, oh, we give the commands to an Irish commander and the special forces to an Austrian commander in order to show that this mission is not French. So we give it the command to a neutral state in order to show that it's not French. So neutral states are an asset for the European Union, and as this example shows. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Michelle gets nervous.
Thank you, Professor Heinz. Just to manage the time, I know this is a very interesting discussion, and there are so many questions that we are receiving, and we highly welcome all the comments and the questions that you have, because this is a safe space to discuss all the comments and questions that we have. But before I ask the questions regarding Ireland and also other questions that we have on the chat box, let me just hear last comments from Professor Jussi before he left our call. Professor Jussi, any final remarks that you would like to share to our group today and to the participants of this neutrality course? And in advance, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing us your expertise.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. Well, again, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's very exciting, and I've learned a lot also from Heinz and everybody. Lots of good questions. I think one thought that it may seem to many of you that I've been very dismissive or negative about neutrality as a consequence of Finland's decision to join NATO. Quite the contrary, I would say that in fact the Finnish history of neutrality in the Cold War context in particular was quite important, quite unique, and I think Heinz sort of alluded to the Helsinki conference and all of this. I think one aspect about neutrality that I did not mention at all, and Finnish neutrality, is the idea of the country playing some kind of a mediating role in the between East and West, and which was the term that often is used in this regard. And I think the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe that was launched, the first meeting was in Helsinki in 1975, is a sort of an example of the bigger geopolitical role of mediating between two hostile blocs, so acting as a sort of, I don't know what's the right term, a midwife in some ways for a process of detente between two hostile sides. I think that is very important. That gives that makes neutrality valuable, made it valuable then, and I think in this context, while it's not Finland that is going to be playing this kind of role in the near future, I mean, there are still, of course, neutral countries, non-aligned countries, and I think that is really, given the tensions that we see today, whether it's in the context of Ukraine, whether it's in the context of the Middle East, Gaza, and beyond Gaza also. These days, I think neutrality and the ability to have these sort of go in betweens, if you will, the importance of that has not diminished. And while the names of those countries and players will change over time, it doesn't diminish the value and the importance of all that.
Thank you, Professor.
Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Jussi. That's
Thank you, everybody.
Encouraging. Thank you for being with us today. And we'll continue with our Q&A. I'll just run through the questions that we have for Ireland, and given the limited of time, I don't think that we can answer all the questions today, but as we said, just post us the questions via email and we'll directly send that to our speakers. And for Roger, here are some questions related to the Ireland. Someone asked for further clarification on the last argument, how might Sinn Féin, hopefully I pronounce it right, change the constitution? And could you please further elaborate on how Irish neutrality is compromised through involvement in EU militarism and use of Shannon Airport by US military? And another question, how might neutrality impact on discussions surrounding potential Irish reunification and so-called legacy issues in the North? Is the debate ready for this complexity? Another question, is there any fear that Ireland could give up on neutrality in exchange for unity? How does Ireland neutrality affect the British Parliament panel debate discussions re Irish reunification? And the last comment is that Ireland also participated in Article 42.7 in the same way, but they sent more troops to the EU training mission in Mali, which are not strictly peacekeeping. So, Roger, you might choose at least to answer the most important ones, they think, and then we'll have the other questions also answered via email. Roger, the floor is yours. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're here.
Okay. Essentially, we have a constitution that was voted on by the Irish people in the 1930s, and it's clearly stated that all power resides with the Irish people. So we have a democratic right to amend our own existing constitution at any time, and that's happened since the foundation of the state. Since that constitution was established in 38. So we would argue, and have always argued, that you can institutionalize neutrality into the constitution, and that will be the overall objective of those people who advocate and support neutrality. And as I said, the figure is roughly about 66% of people still support Irish neutrality. That's that particular issue. Reunification is a very good issue. As you know, when Ireland was partitioned in our War of Independence against the British Empire kept 6 counties. And that's all being transformed now, because for the first time ever, Irish Republicans are now the leading party in the Six Counties itself, which is still British. So it could be at some stage or other, all that, and that would be PANA's objective, that all Ireland would eventually be a neutral state, and the Six Counties that are currently in NATO would terminate. So it's an ongoing campaign issue or issue to be raised. It was made a few times, of course, that neutrality in every country, in any country all over the world, is not permanent. I mean, neutrality is just part of it, is just an ideological position adopted by certain states who don't want to become part of major empires. And obviously, our neutrality was a direct consequence of our national war of independence against the British Empire. That doesn't mean that there are now people who are in power who are increasingly pro-European. You know, as they see the EU not as a partnership of individual states for the purpose of trade and commerce, the way a lot of Irish people would, but they would see Ireland as just a small region of a European empire with its own army. Now, that was discussed earlier on. And it's a long way to go because the French tend to be French, the Germans tend to be German, and the Irish tend to be Irish, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very difficult longer term objective, even if it ever is going to be an objective that could be achieved. So I'm not that concerned about that. The use of Shannon Airport is a complete rejection of international law as it applies to Irish to neutrality. A state that is neutral cannot legally give in international law give its territory to be used by belligerents involved in a war. Yet, nevertheless, millions of US troops have landed in Shannon Airport, and that's continuing. There's a large number of US troops landing in Shannon Airport to bring weapons to Israel to kill Palestinians. So, you know, you could say we're not, but a lot of it's got to do with sheer fear of America. I mean, there's only so much you can do. Like, we were neutral in the Second World War, and there's a lot of, you know, so you have to cope with problems. But we the organization I'm in and another group, major group called Shannon Watch, lead the campaign, especially Shannon Watch. They lead the campaign against the use of Shannon Airport by Americans in their never-ending war somewhere or other in Europe or beyond. No, I don't want to go on. You have a limited amount of time. So how much time do I have?
At least 1 minute. For I know we received so many questions, and we apologize to all the participants that we cannot address all the questions for today. But at least 1 minute more to 2 minutes to wrap up and to your final words to the participants, Roger.
Well, why don't you ask me one question and I'll try and answer that and leave it.
Okay. I think there's also some question here about surrounding British Parliament. How does Ireland's neutrality affect the British Parliament panel debate discussions, Irish unification, and is there a fear that Ireland could give up on neutrality in exchange for unity?
Yes, that's a good question, and I don't think so. Insofar as the people who are in favour of Irish unity are Irish Republicans. Their original, this is Sinn Féin. Their original base was in the late 18th century with Wolfe Tone, who actually was a very strong advocate of Irish neutrality. That didn't mean he wouldn't get support from other countries like France to get rid of the British Empire from our country. But it was clear in his papers, which I've read, that in his discussions with the French state at the time, he made clear that as far as he was concerned and United Irishmen were concerned, is that Ireland would stay neutral even if the help of the French was successful. But we lost that particular war with the British, and that conflict between us and the British Union is not going away anytime soon. It's been a core part of our history since 1169, which is quite some time ago. So that's what defines our neutrality, and I just don't accept. Now, you never know. Like, I could be very wrong about this, because there are certain people in Ireland who want to be part of a European empire, and getting rid of neutrality in that context is strongly advocated. But I still believe, certainly all the public opinion polls show that Irish people are Irish, and they still want to be Irish, in an Irish way, be neutral. The last point is, of course, that we have, and don't see ourselves as simply being Europeans. We have huge connections all over the world, and we're just part of the United Nations is a much more powerful concept among a lot of Irish, I think personally, most Irish people.
Thank you, Roger. And now we're going to have the last final remarks for our speakers. I'll go first with Heinz and then Roger. Heinz, any final remarks for our participants in this neutrality course?
I talked already a lot, and so unless there's a final question, I skip. So because there's lots to say, but I don't want to open another box. So is there any question? Then I would, of course, like to respond. Otherwise, thank you so much for the debate. I learned also a lot from the other speakers and the questions as well. Let's continue and the debate on neutrality, which is very important. Now it's pretty much in all the countries what we have discussed. Neutrality is pretty much under attack, and the opponents of neutrality have been successful in Finland and not yet in Ireland and Austria. So, okay, thank you for the invitation, for the debate. Michelle.
Thank you, Professor Heinz. And any final remarks, Roger, from your end?
Well, finally, just thank you very much for organizing this event. I think it's extremely crucial that people in different parts of the different states of Europe get the opportunity to discuss the issue, even if many of the people in those states aren't neutral. I think it's important that certainly, if there was an objective of Ireland, is to have a European partnership of neutral states rather than the growing power of NATO, and which is the other option, and the destruction of NATO, and the destruction of Irish neutrality. And I think cooperation between the different states in Europe is quite crucial to achieve that objective. So thank you.
Thank you, Heinz. Thank you, Roger, for being with us today. And thank you for all our participants for thought-provoking questions as well. We have so much debates and ongoing discussions that we receive from you, and it enriched a lot our discussions. It made this webinar more meaningful and insightful. So we hope to see you on our next webinar session. Now, our next webinar session will look more on the case of the Global South. So see you on our third session of this neutrality series next Monday, same time, same Zoom link, and have a good week, everyone. And if you have further questions, just email us. And thank you, Professor Heinz. Thank you, Roger. And have a great, peaceful day to all of you. Thank you.